The rain came heavy and warm, drumming on the tin roof of Redwoods Station, a small, weathered stop along Montana's old rail line. Summer storms here could turn daylight into dusk, and tonight the sky hung low and restless. She appeared first, a woman moving fast down the slick platform, soaked through, hair plastered to her face, clutching a small box as if the world inside it might shatter. Far down the platform, a freight train's horn bellowed, its lights cutting through the curtain of rain. At the far end, under the dim glow of a single lamp, a man in a worn field jacket watched her approach, a German shepherd at his side. Ranger's ears flicked forward, muscles tense. Ethan Cole had seen this look before, someone running from something they could not yet name. She appeared first, stepping down from the last freight car like a ghost from another life. Maggie Hayes was 35, of average height, but with the lean, wiry frame of someone who had gone too long without proper meals. Her wet brown hair clung in tangled strands to a pale face, marked with fresh bruises and older, fading ones. A yellowed mark along her jaw, the swelling at her cheekbone, a faint scar cutting across her lower lip. Her gray eyes darted over the platform, searching for danger the way a bird watches the sky for hawks. Her jeans were torn at the knee, her shirt soaked through, clinging to shoulders that seemed narrower than they should be. In her arms she held a small wooden box, the varnish worn away in places, and she pressed it to her chest as though it contained her last breath. She moved carefully, limping slightly on her right foot, but even that caution couldn't disguise the exhaustion etched into every step. At the far end of the platform, Ethan Cole waited beneath the dripping eaves of the freight office. He was 42, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame still carrying the hardness of a man trained for war, though the years since had left their marks. His hair, once black, was now peppered with strands of gray, cut short in the habit of a soldier. A neatly trimmed beard followed the square set of his jaw, its lines sharpened by a face that had seen too much sun in the deserts of Iraq and too little rest in the years since. His eyes, a deep hazel, carried the weight of sandstorms, patrol nights, and the quiet funerals of men he had called brothers. He kept to himself, spoke little in town, and worked on the edge of the valley mending fences and tending livestock for the few ranchers who knew better than to ask about the nightmares that woke him. The war had stripped away his taste for idle talk, but it had left him one thing, an unshakable instinct to read trouble before it arrived. Beside him sat Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, a dog bred for service and trained for combat. Ranger's black and tan coat gleamed even in the dim light, the dense fur beating with rain. He had the powerful build of a working dog, muscular shoulders, intelligent dark eyes, and a scar tracing along his left hind leg from a roadside bomb in Iraq that had taken 2 human lives and nearly his own. Since returning home, Ranger had become Ethan's shadow, a living tether that pulled him through the worst days and anchored him on the quieter ones. The dog's ears pricked forward now, attention fixed on the lone woman moving toward them. Ethan had come for a shipment of barbed wire, nothing more, but the sight of her froze him in place. She moved like someone who had been running for far too long, the kind of movement you only learn when fear has become your second skin. As she passed beneath one of the weak overhead lights, he saw the bruises in full and the way her fingers whitened around the wooden box. The look on her face was not the open fear of someone being chased in this moment. It was the guarded, brittle look of someone who had been chased for months. She took 3 more steps before her body gave out. It was sudden, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, one moment upright, the next collapsing in a heap onto the slick planks of the platform. There was no cry for help, no reaching out to anyone nearby. Just silence, the rain hammering around her, and the small box pressed between her and the boards. Ranger moved first. The German shepherd sprang forward, closing the distance in seconds, planting himself between her and a pair of curious onlookers who had started toward her. The dog's hackles lifted, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest, his gaze sharp on the men until they took a cautious step back. Ethan followed, crossing the platform in long, deliberate strides, the sound of his boots drowned by the rain. Up close, she seemed even smaller, as if whatever had brought her here had already hollowed her out. Ethan crouched beside her, water dripping from the brim of his jacket. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her pulse faint but present beneath cold skin. He reached for the box she clutched, but her grip was iron, her knuckles pale against the dark wood. He left it. Some things you didn't take from people, not if you wanted them to believe you meant no harm. Easy, he murmured, not sure if she could hear him. You're safe now. The words felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't said them to anyone in years. He slid an arm beneath her shoulders and another under her knees. She weighed almost nothing, as if fear and hunger had worn her down to the bare essentials. Rising to his full height with her in his arms, he turned toward the street without waiting for the station master or anyone else to object. The station master, a stooped man in a damp cap, called after him, "She yours, Cole?" Ethan didn't answer. He adjusted his grip and kept walking, Ranger pacing beside him, the dog's gaze sweeping the street for anything out of place. The clinic wasn't far, a squat white building at the corner of Main and Willow, the paint peeling but the windows warm with light. Dr. Elijah Gardner had lived in Redwood Valley for more than 3 decades, a man of 65 with wiry limbs and a face creased from both sun and concern. His hair had gone entirely white, but his eyes were still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was the sort who remembered every injury and every birth in the valley, a quiet keeper of the town's unspoken histories. When Ethan stepped through the door with the woman in his arms, Gardner didn't waste time with questions. "Back room," he said, pushing open the door to the small exam area. Ethan laid her down on the narrow bed, his hands careful to keep her box against her chest, until her fingers finally loosened their hold. "She came off the freight," Ethan said, straightening. "Didn't get far before she collapsed." Gardner's gaze swept over her, taking in the bruises, the thinness, the way her hands curled even in unconsciousness, as if bracing for a blow. "Not the first time someone's run to this valley," he murmured, "but she's in worse shape than most." He began examining her with the efficient, gentle touch of someone who'd seen enough to know what not to ask yet. Ethan stayed near the door, Ranger lying at his feet, the dog's ears flicking at every sound from outside. He told himself he was only here until Gardner confirmed she would live. That was the reasonable thing, the detached thing. But reason had nothing to do with the pull he felt. The same pull he'd felt overseas when he saw someone too wounded to keep moving. The pull that said, "If you leave them, you'll never forgive yourself." Gardner looked up from where he was checking her pulse. She'll need rest, food, and time, and someone to make sure she's not back on the street tomorrow night. His gaze held Ethan's for a beat longer than necessary, and though no one said the words out loud, the decision was already made. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady drumming, the storm's fury giving way to something quieter, but no less insistent. Ethan glanced down at Ranger. The dog's eyes were fixed on the bed, his body still as stone, as if guarding the line between her and the rest of the world. Ethan knew then that he wasn't leaving, not tonight, not until he knew for certain that whatever she had run from wouldn't find her here. The sharp scent of antiseptic lingered in the warm air of Dr. Elijah Gardner's clinic. The small space was lit by a single overhead bulb, its pale glow casting soft shadows on the shelves, lined with neatly labeled jars and medical supplies. Outside, rain still drummed against the tin roof, but here, the sound felt distant, muffled by the thick walls. Maggie Hayes sat on the edge of the worn examination table, her damp clothes replaced by a simple gray cotton gown. She was 35, with a lean frame that suggested both endurance and neglect. Her long chestnut hair, tangled and still damp, clung to her shoulders, and her pale skin bore the faded remnants of freckles, most of them now overshadowed by bruises in varying shades of yellow, purple, and blue. She kept her gaze low, her hands curled protectively around the small wooden box that never left her side. Dr. Elijah Gardner, a man in his early 60s, moved with the precision of someone who had been doing this work for decades. He was tall but slightly stooped, his wiry build wrapped in a well-worn wool sweater over a white shirt. His silver hair was cut short, and his eyes, sharp, gray, and endlessly observant, seemed to take in every detail without judgment. Years of practicing in a rural Montana town had made him both pragmatic and quietly compassionate. Still, as his gloved hands gently probed the bruises on Maggie's wrist, his jaw tightened. "These aren't fresh," he murmured, almost to himself. "Some are weeks old." He noted the narrow marks encircling her wrists, signs of being bound, and the deep fading bruise along her ribs. Ethan Cole stood near the doorway, leaning against the wall with arms crossed over his broad chest. At 42, His body carried the sturdy, squared-off frame of a man who had spent years in the military, but his posture carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. His face, rugged and defined, bore faint lines around the eyes, remnants of sun and sand from Iraq. The dark stubble along his jaw gave him an unshaven edge, and his brown eyes rarely softened, except when they flicked briefly toward Ranger. Tonight, though, his gaze was fixed on Maggie, assessing, measuring, as if cataloging signs of danger. He knew better than to push a wounded person to talk. Some truths had to be approached slowly. Ranger, his 5-year-old German shepherd, lay across the clinic's threshold, his black and tan coat sleek despite the rain earlier. His amber eyes tracked every movement in the room, ears twitching with each creak of the old floorboards. He had been trained for military service, but had retired alongside Ethan, and his instincts were still razor sharp. Whenever footsteps echoed faintly in the hall outside, Ranger's head lifted, gaze narrowing until the sound passed. Maggie noticed him often, her eyes lingering on the steady, unblinking way he seemed to guard the space between her and the world beyond the door. Gardner asked a few questions in a voice deliberately calm, but Maggie's answers were clipped, almost mechanical. Her voice was low, hoarse from either disuse or recent strain, and she avoided eye contact. When he asked how she came to be at the station, she simply said, "I needed to get off the train." When he asked where she was headed, she shook her head slightly. Each time the conversation turned toward her injuries, her fingers tightened on the box in her lap. The doctor exchanged a glance with Ethan, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Ethan shifted his weight, his boot heels clicking softly against the floor. He wasn't here to interrogate her. He knew how fast trust could shatter. But her silence stirred something in him. It was the same look he'd seen on the faces of civilians he'd helped evacuate from villages in Iraq. Not just fear of what had happened, but fear of what could still come. A storm gust rattled the clinic windows, and Maggie flinched involuntarily. Ranger noticed, his ears pricking before he let out a low, quiet rumble. Ethan straightened from the wall. "I'll stay," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Gardner, knowing Ethan's stubborn streak, didn't argue. "You can use the chair in the corner," he said, nodding toward a battered armchair. "I'll bring blankets." Later that night, Gardner stepped out briefly to fetch more supplies from the back, leaving Ethan and Maggie alone. She kept her gaze on the box, tracing its carved edges with her fingertips. Ethan spoke softly, more to fill the quiet than to pry. "You're safe here. No one's going to touch you while I'm in the room." Maggie's shoulders tensed at first, but after a moment, she nodded once, almost imperceptibly. As the clock neared midnight, Ethan stayed seated but alert, eyes half closed, yet listening for every sound beyond the walls. Ranger remained at his post, head resting on his paws, tail occasionally twitching when distant noises drifted in from the street. It wasn't just guarding Maggie. It was guarding the fragile stillness that now wrapped around her like a fragile shell. Ethan knew that if she woke up alone, surrounded by strangers, the shell might crack. And something told him that once it did, whatever was chasing her would be closer than any of them liked. He didn't know yet what was inside that box she carried, or what it meant, but he recognized the way her grip on it tightened whenever the wind rattled the door. It wasn't just possession. It was protection. And whatever she feared, Ethan suspected it wasn't far behind. Morning broke with a pale, clouded light that seeped into the windows of Dr. Gardner's clinic. The storm from the night before had passed, but the streets still glistened with rainwater, and the air carried that faint metallic scent left behind after a night of heavy weather. Maggie Hayes sat quietly in the corner, her wooden box balanced on her knees, watching as the doctor gathered his satchel and coat. She had changed back into her own clothes, dried now by the small stove in the clinic, but the fabric still showed signs of wear, threadbare at the elbows and faded from years of use. Dr. Elijah Gardner, his sweater replaced by a clean white shirt and dark vest, stood before her with a kind but decisive look. "You can't stay here, Maggie," he said in his steady, unhurried tone. "It's not safe for a woman to sleep in a clinic. Too many people come and go, but I know someone who might be able to help." He glanced toward Ethan, who stood by the door with Ranger at his side. Ethan gave a brief nod. He didn't argue. Gardner had lived in this town for decades. If he trusted someone, it meant something. The walk to the dress shop was short, just a few blocks down Main Street. The rain had left puddles along the cobblestone, and the air still held a summer heaviness. Maggie kept close to Gardner, her gaze flicking at every sound, the clatter of a wagon wheel, the slam of a shop door. Ethan followed behind, broad-shouldered and alert, Ranger pacing in perfect rhythm at his side, nose occasionally lifting to the air. The shop stood between a bakery and a small bookshop, its front window displaying elegant dresses in muted tones of blue, cream, and lavender. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Rose Whitman Fine Garments." Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender sachets and pressed cotton. At the sound of the bell over the door, a woman emerged from behind a counter, folding a length of soft gray fabric over her arm. Rose Whitman was in her early 50s, tall and slender, with the kind of posture that made her seem both graceful and unyielding. Her hair, a deep auburn streaked with silver, was twisted neatly into a low bun, and her skin was pale with the faint creases of someone who had smiled often in her younger years, but less so lately. She wore a simple navy dress with a fitted bodice, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing long, capable hands that bore faint marks from years of sewing. Her green eyes were steady, but not unkind. She studied Maggie for a moment before setting the fabric aside. "Elijah," she said, her voice low and even. "I wasn't expecting you this early." Her gaze shifted to Maggie, then to the wooden box in her arms. "This is her?" "This is Maggie," Gardner replied. "She needs a safe place, at least for a while. I thought of the room above your shop." Rose hesitated, glancing toward the stairs tucked in the corner. "I don't rent it often," she said, "but if she's willing to help in the store, we could make it work." Her eyes softened slightly as she looked back at Maggie. "It's small, but it's clean, and no one bothers me here." The room upstairs was indeed small, just a narrow bed with a quilt, a wooden dresser, and a single window that overlooked the quiet street below. Sunlight spilled across the worn floorboards, and the faint scent of lavender lingered even here. Maggie ran her fingers over the quilt, noting the neat, hand-stitched patterns. She gave a small nod. "It's fine," she said softly, though her grip on the box never loosened. Rose left her to settle in, returning downstairs to open the shop for customers. Gardner offered a parting word of reassurance before heading back to the clinic. Ethan lingered longer, leaning against the doorframe as Maggie unpacked a few small belongings from her coat pocket. Only a folded handkerchief and a tarnished locket. He didn't ask about them. Over the next several days, Ethan found excuses to return. Once, it was to check the hinges on the back door, another time to fix a loose step on the stairway. Each time, Ranger trotted up the stairs first, tail swishing but eyes alert, scanning the small room before lying down near the bed. Maggie didn't speak much, but she no longer flinched when Ranger approached. Sometimes, while Rose measured fabric or served customers, Maggie would quietly press scraps of cloth into Ranger's reach, watching him sniff them before curling back up by the stairs. Rose, for her part, kept her questions to herself. She had lost her husband to an accident on the rail lines years ago, a tragedy that left her managing the shop alone. Her grief had settled into a kind of quiet resilience, and she had no patience for gossip. If Maggie wanted to keep her past to herself, Rose would let her. Still, she noticed the way Maggie's eyes darted to the window whenever heavy boots passed on the street, or the way her shoulders stiffened when someone raised their voice outside. One humid afternoon, as Ethan tightened the screws on the back door, a wagon rolled past, its wheels crunching over gravel. Maggie, standing by the counter with a stack of folded skirts, froze. Ranger's head lifted instantly, ears pricked, gaze narrowing on the sound. The wagon moved on, but Ethan caught the way Maggie's breathing had quickened, her fingers clenching the fabric so tightly the seams nearly split. He didn't say anything, not yet. But each time he left the shop, he found himself glancing over his shoulder, scanning the street for strangers lingering too long. Ranger had taken to lying at the base of the stairs leading to Maggie's room, even when Ethan wasn't there, as if the dog had decided the job was now his alone. By the end of the week, the shop's routine had settled into a fragile rhythm. Rose at the counter, Maggie working quietly beside her, Ethan finding reasons to stop by, and Ranger keeping watch like a silent sentinel. But underneath the calm, Ethan knew something else was moving, some shadow that had followed Maggie here, waiting for its moment. And when it came, he intended to be ready. The heat of the summer afternoon pressed against the dress shop's glass windows, warping the reflections of passers-by on Main Street. In the small room above the shop, Maggie had been mending a seam on a pale blue dress when a soft knock came at the door. Rose entered, her tall frame casting a long shadow across the wooden floorboards. She was carrying a folded copy of the Silverbrook Gazette, the faint scent of lavender clinging to her sleeves. Her green eyes held something guarded. Without a word, she crossed the room and handed Maggie the paper. It was there, in the lower half of the second page, that the world seemed to narrow into a single moment. A grainy photograph of her own face stared back at her beneath the bold header, "Missing Margaret Hayes." The text beneath claimed she was wanted for questioning, mentally unstable, and possibly a danger to herself. At the bottom, in smaller print, it read, "Last known address, Boston, Massachusetts." Maggie's hands began to tremble. "Maggie," Rose said gently, though her voice carried the firmness of someone who had seen enough lies in her life to recognize truth when it was cornered. "I thought you should see this." Before Maggie could respond, the jingle of the shop bell sounded below, followed by Ethan's steady voice greeting Rose from the stairwell. Ranger's paws thudded softly against the wood as he bounded up the steps, his black and tan coat glistening with a light sheen of sweat from the heat outside. His amber eyes darted between Maggie and Rose before settling on Maggie's pale face. "Rose sent me a note," Ethan said, stepping into the room. He looked broader than usual in the narrow space, his square jaw set beneath a short beard flecked with gray. A man who had seen enough of the world to distrust quick answers, he scanned the paper in Maggie's lap without touching it. "We need to talk, but not here." Rose gave a single nod, as if she'd expected this, and returned downstairs. Within minutes, Ethan had ushered Maggie outside, the wooden box still clutched to her chest, and led her to his truck, parked along the side of the shop. Ranger leapt into the back seat, tail rigid but silent. They drove out of town, following a narrow dirt road that climbed toward the ridge overlooking Silverbrook. The fields shimmered under the lowering sun, cicadas droning in the background. At the crest, Ethan pulled over near a patch of wild grass, the smell of pine mixing with the faint tang of warm dust. Maggie stepped out slowly, the hem of her skirt catching in the tall grass. Ethan leaned against the hood of the truck, arms crossed, eyes watching her, but without pressing her. Ranger sat nearby, ears pricked, his gaze never straying far from her. For a long moment, Maggie simply stood there, staring toward the horizon, where the sun bled into shades of gold and crimson. Then, she drew in a shuddering breath. "You should know who I am," she began, her voice quiet but sharp-edged, "and why I can't go back." She told him about Victor Hayes, how he had first seemed charming, a man with a warm smile and the kind of wealth that made people trust too quickly. In truth, he was a man who measured control in bruises and silences. Maggie's posture stiffened as she spoke, her fingers tightening around the edge of the wooden box. She described the years of enduring his temper, the quiet humiliation in public, the violence behind closed doors. Her voice faltered only when she spoke of her children. Clara, 7 years old, with her bright laugh and unruly curls. Joseph, 5, who still mispronounced certain words and liked to fall asleep clutching his toy train. "I tried to take them and leave," she said, her eyes glistening but defiant. "But Victor has money, connections. He painted me as unstable, said I couldn't care for them. The court believed him." Her voice cracked. "I never even got to say goodbye." Ethan's jaw clenched, his broad shoulders drawing tighter. Years in the military had taught him to hide his reactions, but some truth scraped too deep to conceal. Maggie's voice grew colder as she recounted the day she discovered the papers. Victor's marriage certificate to another woman, Catherine Reynolds, dated 2 years before he wed her. "It means my marriage to him was never real. It was a lie from the beginning. But if I go to the police with this, he'll know where I am, and I'll never see my children again." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain from the valley below. Ranger moved closer, pressing his warm flank against Maggie's leg. She glanced down, the corners of her mouth trembling into the faintest shadow of a smile. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. "If what you're saying is true, and I believe it is, you're not the one who should be hiding." His eyes narrowed toward the distant train tracks that curved away from town. "Victor will send someone. Men like him don't let go of loose ends." For the rest of the evening, they stayed on the ridge, going over what Maggie remembered. Names, dates, small details that might matter later. Ethan said little, but his mind was already turning toward what needed to be done. By the time they returned to the shop, night had fallen, and the street lamps cast long shadows over the cobblestones. As Maggie climbed the stairs to her small room, Ranger settled once more at the base, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes open, watching the darkened street through the glass of the front door. It was clear to Ethan that from this moment forward, nothing about Maggie's quiet life above the dress shop would be truly safe again. The next morning dawned with a thick layer of summer humidity hanging over Redwood Valley. The streets glistened faintly from an early rain, and the air carried that heavy metallic scent that promised more storms before nightfall. Ethan stood at the counter of Rose's shop, the Silverbrook Gazette folded neatly beside him. Maggie sat in the corner, her hands still and pale on the wooden box, as if afraid to let it out of her sight. Ethan had spent half the night thinking, the other half pacing his kitchen, while Ranger watched from the doorway. The more he turned over the details, the more certain he became. That marriage certificate was more than just a personal revelation. It was leverage. "If we can get the original records from Helena," he said now, his voice steady but deliberate, "we can prove what Victor did. You'd have the legal grounds to fight for your kids." Maggie looked up sharply, strands of her dark hair falling into her eyes. She had slept little, her skin pale under the morning light. "Helena's hours from here," she murmured, "and if he has people watching—" "I know how to move without being seen," Ethan interrupted, not unkindly, his jaw tightened slightly, a habit born from years in Iraq where hesitation could be fatal. "I've run reconnaissance in worse places. This is just a different kind of battlefield." Ranger, now 6 years old and still built like a coiled spring, padded over and pressed his nose against Maggie's hand. His black and tan coat was sleek from a recent brushing, his amber eyes warm but alert. He seemed to sense the tension crackling between them. "I'm not dragging you into my mess," Maggie insisted, her voice shaking despite the firmness of her words. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I'm already in this. You don't get to walk away from people who need you." Something in his tone made Maggie stop arguing. By mid-morning, the plan was set. Ethan would drive to Helena under the guise of visiting an old army friend, keeping his route unpredictable. Ranger would stay behind to guard Maggie, a role the dog took to with quiet seriousness. After Ethan left, Rose closed the shop's front blinds and beckoned Maggie into the back room. Rose was tall and slender, her chestnut hair pinned in a neat twist, but there was an unshakable steadiness in her green eyes that made people trust her. She had been married once, briefly, but her husband's sudden death in a rail yard accident years ago had left her both fiercely independent and suspicious of people's intentions. "We need to make you less recognizable," Rose said, pulling a pair of scissors from her sewing drawer. Maggie hesitated, her fingers brushing the ends of her dark hair as if they were the last piece of her old self she could control. Still, she sat down in the wooden chair, and Rose began trimming the length, shaping it into a chin-length cut that framed her face differently. They worked out a set of quiet protocols. Maggie would enter and exit through the back alley that led to the loading dock. She would keep a scarf and sunglasses nearby if she needed to go out. And if Rose spotted anyone unfamiliar lingering near the shop, she would hang a white dress in the front window as a silent signal to stay upstairs. For the rest of the day, Maggie kept herself busy in the shop. She pinned hems, repaired a tear in an elderly customer's jacket, and helped a young mother choose fabric for her daughter's school dress. Outwardly, she blended into the slow rhythm of the town's summer life, smiling faintly when spoken to. But inside, every time the shop bell rang, her pulse quickened. That night, back in her small upstairs room, Maggie settled into bed with Ranger sprawled across the floor at the foot of the door. The wooden box rested on the table beside her lamp, its presence both a comfort and a constant reminder of what was at stake. Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then growing heavier, pattering against the glass like insistent fingers. At one point, near midnight, Ranger's head lifted. His ears twitched and a low rumble built in his chest. Maggie sat up, heart racing, straining to hear beyond the sound of the rain. Faintly, too faint for anyone else but the dog to catch, there was the crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. Ranger stood, his body stiff, tail straight, a silent sentinel between her and the world beyond the door. The sound faded, leaving only the rain, but Maggie did not sleep for the rest of the night. Still, knowing Ranger was there, alert, unwavering, let her hold on to a fragile thread of safety. The morning light in Redwood Valley was muted, filtered through a thin veil of summer rain clouds. The shop smelled faintly of pressed linen and cedar polish when the bell above the door chimed. Maggie looked up from the sewing table and froze for a fraction of a second before masking it with a polite smile. The man who stepped inside looked as though he had been carved out of some colder, more calculating world. He was in his late 40s, tall with a narrow frame, the lines of his charcoal gray vest perfectly straight, a matching jacket draped neatly over his arm. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the shop's modest light fixtures. His hair, the color of wet ash, was combed back with meticulous precision, and his pale blue eyes swept the room like searchlights. His face was lean, clean-shaven, and carried the faint, hardened angles of someone used to appraising people rather than conversing with them. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, voice smooth but carrying an undertone that made the words feel less like a greeting and more like the opening move of a negotiation. "Name's Daniel Pinkerton, private investigator." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a stiff sheet of paper, a pencil sketch of a young woman. Maggie's stomach tightened. The hair in the drawing was longer, the cheeks fuller, but the likeness was unmistakable. Her. "I'm looking for this woman," Pinkerton continued, holding the sketch at an angle that let Maggie see it clearly but kept it shielded from any passers-by outside. "She's gone missing. Family's worried. I'm prepared to pay generously for any information leading to her whereabouts." Maggie forced a small shake of her head. "Sorry, haven't seen anyone like that." Her voice was steady, but her fingers curled tightly around the fabric in her lap. Pinkerton studied her for a moment too long, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint, unreadable smirk. "If you do, you know where to reach me." He set a cream-colored business card on the counter, nodded once, and walked out into the rain, the click of his shoes on the wooden floorboards fading like a metronome winding down. Behind the counter, Ranger had been watching, every muscle taut beneath his black and tan coat. As soon as Pinkerton turned his back, the dog emitted a low, throaty growl, his amber eyes fixed on the door until it closed. Rose appeared from the back room just as the door shut. She didn't need to ask. She had caught enough of the conversation to know trouble when she saw it. Without a word, she stepped behind the counter, pulled out her phone, and sent a short encrypted message to Ethan. "We've got a problem. Man asking questions. Name Pinkerton." Over the next few days, Daniel Pinkerton became an unwelcome fixture in Redwood Valley. People noticed his presence, how he sat too straight at the cafe, sipping black coffee and watching the door, how he lingered at the post office, pretending to browse greeting cards while listening to the chatter, how he stood just a little too long at the gas station after filling his sleek black sedan, scanning the lot before driving away. On the fourth afternoon, he returned to the shop under the pretense of inquiring about a suit alteration. Maggie kept her voice polite and her movements measured, but her heart thudded in her chest. When he drifted toward the door that led to the back workroom, Ranger moved like a shadow, silent, sudden, placing himself between Pinkerton and the threshold. The dog's ears were pinned forward, lips peeling back to reveal a flash of white teeth. Pinkerton stopped, a faint, amused chuckle slipping past his lips. "Protective animal you've got there." "Only with strangers who forget their manners," Rose replied from behind the counter, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. He retreated then, tipping an imaginary hat before leaving again, but the message was clear. He wasn't done. Word spread quickly in the small town. At the diner, a man in oil-stained overalls muttered to a waitress about the fancy-dressed fella snooping around. At the library, Mrs. Donnelly, who ran the front desk, whispered to a patron that the stranger had been asking odd questions about Boston. By the week's end, Pinkerton's name was on everyone's lips, and a subtle network of eyes began to follow him wherever he went. One rainy evening, as Maggie locked up the shop, she caught sight of Pinkerton across the street, standing under the awning of the hardware store. He wasn't looking at her directly, but his presence was deliberate, like a shadow that refused to vanish. Ranger's fur bristled, and he pulled slightly against the leash, wanting to close the distance. Maggie turned the key in the lock and forced herself to walk inside without glancing back, telling herself over and over that Ethan would be back soon. But as she drew the curtains against the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Pinkerton's gaze had already found its way past them. The storm had rolled in quietly, turning the streets of Redwood Valley into slick ribbons of shadow and glistening rain. It was close to midnight when Maggie heard the low rumble of a truck pulling into the alley behind the shop. Her breath caught. Moments later, the familiar click of the back door lock turning made her tense, until she heard Ranger's distinctive shake, the jingle of his collar filling the silence. Ethan stepped inside, rain dripping from the brim of his battered field jacket. His face, square-jawed, with lines carved deep around the mouth, was set in a grim, almost haunted expression. The man was 45, his once sandy hair now streaked with silver, and tonight his eyes, usually the steel gray of a man accustomed to war, carried the weight of something darker. Ranger stayed at his side, the 5-year-old German shepherd's black and tan coat slick with rain, ears alert as if the night still held threats. "Lock the door," Ethan said, his voice low. Maggie obeyed, and he placed a worn leather satchel on the counter. "I found something in Vermont," he began, pulling out a stack of documents sealed in clear plastic sleeves. The first page made Maggie's blood run cold. A marriage certificate dated 2004, naming Victor Hayes and Catherine Reynolds. "There's no divorce decree," Ethan said, his jaw tightening. "No death certificate either. And before Catherine, there was another wife, Mary Ann Cole, died in what the report calls a domestic accident. No witnesses, no real investigation." Maggie's hands trembled as she turned the pages. Ethan continued, voice steady but edged with disbelief. "It doesn't stop there. Several business partners of Victor's had accidents, car crashes, sudden bankruptcies, mysterious fires, always just before he bought them out or took over their contracts." He slid over another page, a newspaper clipping showing Victor shaking hands with a man in front of a construction site. Ethan tapped the headline. "That man's company burned down a week later." Maggie swallowed hard. "You think Catherine is still alive?" "I think," Ethan said, leaning forward, "if she is, she's the only one who could bring Victor down. And I think he knows that." Ranger gave a low whine, as if sensing the danger in the air. They moved into the small back room, away from the front windows. Rose, who had been upstairs in the apartment, came down wearing an oversized sweater, her auburn hair in a loose braid. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, her freckled face sharpened by suspicion, as Ethan filled her in. "If this is true," she said, "Victor's more than a threat. He's a pattern." The rain intensified, rattling against the roof. Ethan, restless, paced the narrow space, his boots leaving wet prints on the worn wooden floor. "Pinkerton's not here for small talk," he muttered. "If Victor hired him, he's close. That means whatever we do fast." They began mapping connections on the large corkboard Maggie usually used for fabric swatches. Each victim's name was pinned in red, the lines between them crisscrossing until the board looked like a spider's web. Somewhere in that web, Ethan insisted, was Catherine Reynolds, alive or dead. Around 1 a.m., there was a knock on the back door. Ranger's head snapped up, a low growl building in his throat. Ethan drew a deep breath and cracked the door open to find Carl Bennett, the local night shift deputy. Carl was a stocky man in his late 50s, with thinning blonde hair and the kind of weathered face that had seen every variety of trouble. His raincoat was plastered to his frame, and water dripped steadily from the brim of his hat. "Evening, folks," Carl said, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. "Got word from a contact in Helena. Pinkerton's been asking about you, Ethan, by name." That piece of information settled like a stone in the room. Maggie felt her stomach knot. Rose crossed her arms, her gaze darting between Ethan and Carl. "If he knows your name, he knows you're involved." Carl nodded grimly. "And if Victor's as dirty as you're saying, that ain't a good thing." He eyed the board on the wall. "You're building a case, aren't you?" "Trying to," Ethan said. "Then you better watch your backs," Carl warned, pulling the door shut behind him. The rest of the night was spent in tense discussion. Ethan suggested splitting tasks. Rose would quietly check hospital and shelter records for any sign of Catherine. Maggie would reach out to an old friend in Boston who still had ties to the social registry. Ethan himself would take Ranger and follow up on a lead in an abandoned mining town 2 counties over. The mine, according to a source, had been part owned by a shell company linked to Victor. By dawn, the rain had tapered off, leaving the streets silvered in morning mist. Ethan leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on the corkboard one last time. "If Catherine's out there," he said, "we find her before Victor, or Pinkerton. does. Maggie nodded, though her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and resolve. The man she had once thought she knew was emerging as something far more dangerous. And now, with Ethan and Ranger at her side, she understood one chilling truth. The past was not done with her yet. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty front windows of the shop, painting long gold bars across the bolts of fabric stacked along the walls. Maggie was behind the counter, sorting receipts, when the bell above the door gave a quiet chime. She glanced up and froze. A woman stood there, just inside the threshold, dripping from the light summer rain that had just passed. She was in her early 50s, tall and willowy, but with a faint stoop, as though years of watching over her shoulder had bent her frame. Her hair was a striking silver blonde, pulled into a neat twist at the back of her head, but strands had escaped, curling against a pale face drawn tight by worry. Her eyes, clear green, sharp and searching, moved over the shop until they found Maggie. She wore a rain-darkened navy trench coat, and her hands, though elegant, gripped the strap of her leather satchel with white-knuckled tension. "You're Maggie," she said, her voice low, carrying an accent faintly touched by New England. "I'm Catherine Reynolds, or at least I was." Maggie's heart skipped. The name seemed to echo in the quiet room. She stepped out from behind the counter, her mind already racing back to Ethan's words only days before. "Catherine, you're alive?" The woman's lips curved in something between a smile and a wince. "Alive, yes, but not Catherine Reynolds, not on paper. I've lived under another name for more than a decade, and I wouldn't be here if it weren't urgent." Before Maggie could reply, Ethan came in from the back room, Ranger trotting at his side. The German Shepherd, 5 years old, sleek black and tan fur, powerful build, immediately circled the newcomer, sniffing with the cautious precision of a trained protector. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she reached down, palm open, and let Ranger's nose brush her fingers. His ears eased back, his stance relaxing. Ethan's square features tightened, his steel-gray eyes narrowing. "We've been looking for you," he said. "You've been following what's happening?" Catherine set her satchel on the counter and unlatched it, revealing a small stack of weathered manila folders and a bound notebook. "More than following, I've been preparing for years." She paused, eyes flicking toward the windows as if to make sure no one was watching. "Victor will come for Maggie. He's already in motion, and he won't stop. I've seen what he does to people who get in his way. I was one of them." She took a deep breath and began. In measured words, she told them how her marriage to Victor had started with charm and promises, then slipped into control and isolation. She described being moved to a secluded estate, denied contact with family, her every call monitored. Her long fingers tapped the folder as she recounted the night of the fire, a blaze Victor's associates were meant to believe had killed her. "It was the only way to vanish," she said, her voice catching. "I had help from a friend inside his circle, but I haven't dared to reach out until now." Maggie listened, her stomach knotting tighter with each word. The man she'd been married to had been hiding a ghost all along. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his jaw flexing. "We can use this. If your marriage to Victor is still valid, then his marriage to Maggie is illegal," Catherine finished, nodding. "And if we can prove it, the law's on our side. But Victor's an expert at twisting the law and the press. He'll spin any narrative to destroy us." From the back door came the sound of footsteps. Rose entered, carrying a box of fabric samples. She froze when she saw Catherine, eyes widening. "You're—" She stopped herself, setting the box down slowly. Catherine offered a faint, tired smile. "I'm the reason Victor's been chasing shadows all these years." The conversation shifted into low, urgent planning. Catherine would need to stay hidden. Her presence in Redwood Valley could not reach Victor's ears. Ethan promised to protect both women, to keep Ranger close at all times. Maggie agreed to prepare the necessary documents for their case, while Rose suggested a discreet contact in the county courthouse, who might backdate or verify certain records without alerting Victor's legal team. As the rain cleared outside and the street grew quiet, the 3 women and the soldier came to an unspoken understanding. Catherine slid her notebook across the counter toward Ethan. "This has everything I've gathered. Dates, names, transactions. It's not enough for a conviction, but it's a start." Ethan took it, his fingers brushing the worn leather cover. "Then we make it enough." Ranger, lying at Maggie's feet, gave a short huff as if sealing the pact. The morning in Redwood Valley was cool and pale, the kind of early light that made the hills look washed in silver. Maggie was sorting through a fresh shipment of fabric when the postman, a wiry man in his 60s named Frank Weaver, stepped into the shop. Frank had a weathered face tanned from years of walking his route, a neat gray mustache, and eyes that always seemed half amused. Today, though, he looked hesitant. "Got something odd for you, Maggie," he said, handing her a small folded note. "Left in your box without a return address. Thought you'd want it right away." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and unfolded the paper. The message was hastily scrawled in blocky letters. "Your children are near. They want to see you. Meet at the old freight warehouse. 2 p.m. Come alone." Her breath caught. Her children? The words were like a spark in dry grass. Ethan, who had been repairing a loose window hinge at the front, saw the color drain from her face. He walked over, his broad frame casting a shadow across the counter. His close-cropped salt and pepper hair glinted in the light, and the faint lines at the corners of his steel-gray eyes deepened with suspicion. "Let me see that." He read the note, his jaw tightening. "This is bait. Pinkerton style all over it." Ranger, the black and tan German shepherd, was lying near the door. At Ethan's voice, his ears pricked forward, dark eyes sharp with alertness. Ethan crouched to scratch behind the dog's ear. "We'll go, but not alone, and not unprepared." By early afternoon, they drove the truck toward the edge of town. The old freight warehouse sat in a hollow behind the railway tracks, its brick walls mottled with rust stains, broken windows gaping like missing teeth. Maggie sat tense in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap. "If there's even a chance," she began, but Ethan cut in. "We'll check. But you don't leave my sight." As they approached, Ethan parked half a block away, partly shielded by a line of overgrown shrubs. Ranger jumped down first, paws silent on the gravel, nose working the air. The dog's posture shifted, muscles taut, tail low, head turning toward the far side of the building. Ethan followed his gaze and saw it. The shadowed outline of a dark SUV tucked behind a pile of old pallets. Keeping low, Ethan moved closer, Maggie a few steps behind. Ranger crept ahead, his movements deliberate, every sense tuned to danger. 2 men sat inside the SUV. The driver was heavy-set, with close-cropped black hair and a thick neck, a faded tattoo curling up from his collar. His partner was leaner, with a scar cutting across his left cheek, his eyes darting nervously toward the warehouse. Both wore plain jackets, but the bulge of holstered pistols was clear beneath the fabric. On the seat between them lay a handful of heavy-duty zip ties. When Maggie came into view, the passenger door flew open. The scarred man stepped out, trying to mask his urgency with a half smile. "Maggie, we've got news?" His hand slid toward his belt. That was all the opening Ranger needed. With a low, feral growl, the German shepherd launched forward, his jaws clamping onto the man's forearm before the zip tie could be pulled. The man yelled, stumbling backward, the pistol still holstered, but forgotten under the pressure of teeth and muscle. The driver lunged from the SUV, reaching for Maggie, but Ethan was faster. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his shoulder slamming into the man's midsection. They hit the gravel hard, the air whooshing from the driver's lungs as Ethan wrenched his arm behind his back. Years of military discipline showed in the economy of Ethan's movements. Every action precise, no wasted effort. The scuffle drew voices from across the street. A pair of locals, Mrs. Alma Brooks, a retired school teacher with a sharp tongue and a keen sense of right and wrong, and her grandson Caleb, a tall, wiry young man in his 20s, were drawn by the noise. Alma's sharp blue eyes took in the scene at once, and she pulled a phone from her bag. "Sheriff's Department? We've got trouble at the freight warehouse." By the time the first patrol car arrived, lights flashing, Ranger was still holding the scarred man's arm, his growl a steady warning. Ethan released the driver only when Deputy Harlan Briggs, a stout man in his 40s with a ruddy face and a steady hand, clamped cuffs on him. Briggs had been in Redwood Valley all his life. His calm demeanor often hid a fierce protectiveness over the people in town. "Looks like you caught yourselves a couple of snakes," he remarked, glancing from Ethan to Maggie. Within minutes, both suspects were secured in the back of the patrol car. Maggie stood a little apart, arms wrapped around herself, the adrenaline ebbing into a cold, shaky relief. She looked at Ethan, her voice low. "If you hadn't come—" Ethan shook his head. "You're not alone anymore. Remember that." News of the incident spread quickly. By nightfall, the warehouse confrontation had become the talk of the town. Alma Brooks told anyone who would listen how Ethan and that fine dog had stopped an ambush, embellishing the story with dramatic flair. More than a few neighbors dropped by the shop that evening to check on Maggie, offering words of support and quiet promises. "If you need me to testify, I will." Somewhere out there, Pinkerton would hear that his trap had failed. But by the time the sun set, another truth had settled deep in the bones of Redwood Valley. The town had chosen its side, and it was with Maggie. The courthouse in Boston loomed like a stone fortress against a gray November sky, its neoclassical columns streaked with decades of soot and rain. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnished oak and paper that had seen too many hands. Maggie sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight, but her fingers laced tightly in her lap. She wore a modest navy dress and a cream wool shawl, her auburn hair swept into a neat bun. The weight in her eyes was matched by the faint hope flickering behind them. Today could end years of fear. Beside her sat her attorney, Gregory Henshaw, a tall man in his 50s with sharp cheekbones, a clean-shaven jaw, and silver hair combed back so precisely it almost glinted under the courtroom lights. His charcoal suit fit as though it had been stitched for him alone. Gregory was known in Massachusetts legal circles for his relentless cross-examinations and his calm, almost surgical demeanor. A man who had once lost a custody case early in his career and vowed never to let a parent be torn from their children without a fight again. Across the aisle, Victor Dane looked as if the courtroom belonged to him. Immaculate black suit, silk tie, hair styled to perfection. But his pale face held a tightness around the mouth, and his dark eyes darted toward the jury too often. His attorney, Lawrence Price, was a shorter man in his 40s with thinning blonde hair and a perpetual smirk, the kind of lawyer who thrived on intimidation and technicalities. The hearing began with witness statements. Catherine Harrow took the stand first. In her early 40s, Catherine was statuesque and poised, her shoulder-length chestnut hair framing a face that seemed built for truth-telling. She spoke clearly about the sham marriage between Maggie and Victor, how she had personally handled the documents when she worked briefly as a clerk in the county clerk's office years ago. Her testimony, backed by certified records, landed like a stone in still water. The ripples were immediate. Then came Alma Brooks, making the trip from Redwood Valley despite her age. She wore her best Sunday coat, deep green wool with brass buttons, and her cane tapped steadily as she crossed the courtroom floor. Alma's piercing blue eyes swept across the jury box, and her voice carried without strain as she recounted the day she saw Victor's men try to corner Maggie at the freight warehouse. Her matter-of-fact storytelling left no room for doubt, and when she described Ranger's intervention, a few jurors even smiled. Gregory presented the evidence methodically. The fraudulent marriage certificate, sworn statements from Redwood Valley residents, and financial records hinting at Victor's questionable dealings. Each piece was laid on the record with quiet precision. When it was Victor's turn to be questioned, Gregory rose slowly, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Dane," he began in that even, unhurried tone, "how many times have you been the subject of civil complaints in the last 10 years? Lawrence Price immediately objected. But the judge, a broad-shouldered man named Harold Whitcomb, with a square jaw, thinning gray hair, and a reputation for fairness, overruled him. Victor shifted in his seat. "I don't recall," he said. Gregory slid a folder across the table. "Allow me to help. There are 12 recorded incidents, ranging from breach of contract to allegations of coercion. Would you like to explain to the court why so many individuals from different states have accused you of intimidation?" The tension in the room thickened. Victor's replies became shorter, his voice tight, and for the first time, the veneer of control began to crack. By the afternoon recess, the gallery was buzzing. A reporter from the Boston Chronicle, a young woman named Sarah Kimball, with shoulder-length blonde hair and an oversized leather satchel, scribbled notes furiously. She had a keen eye for human drama and a knack for catching the expressions between the spoken words. When the court reconvened, Judge Whitcomb delivered his ruling. In light of the evidence of fraudulent marriage, the credible testimony of witnesses, and the clear indication that Mr. Dane's custody claim is without merit, the court awards full custody of Clara and Joseph Dane to their mother, Margaret Fletcher. Furthermore, This court is ordering a criminal investigation into Mr. Dane's prior conduct. The gavel struck once, and the sound echoed like the breaking of a chain. Maggie's shoulders slumped in relief, and Gregory allowed himself the smallest of satisfied smiles. 3 weeks later, the arrivals hall at Missoula International Airport was filled with the warmth of reunion. Ethan stood near the baggage claim in his worn leather jacket, Ranger at his side, the dog's black and tan coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Ranger's tail wagged furiously the moment Clara came into view. She was 7 now, with long brown hair and a laugh that burst out as she dropped her small backpack to throw her arms around the dog's neck. Joseph, just 4, giggled as Ranger sniffed at his mittened hands. Maggie trailed a few steps behind, her face lit with the kind of joy she hadn't worn in years. The tension lines were softer now, and her eyes shone as she watched her children fuss over Ranger. Ethan stepped forward, offering to take her bag, and for a brief moment, the noise of the airport seemed to fade. They drove back to Redwood Valley as the late winter sun dipped toward the mountains. By the time they pulled into the driveway, the sky had turned a deep rose. The small log house glowed with lamplight, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, the air was scented with pine, and the faint aroma of stew left warming on the stove. Maggie paused at the doorway, Clara clutching her hand, Joseph peering around her leg. For the first time in years, she exhaled without fear. She had crossed the distance from survival to safety, and found, against all odds, a home. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with a trumpet sound or a burst of light from the heavens. Sometimes, they come quietly, in the form of a loyal dog who refuses to give up, or a soldier who still believes in protecting others even after the battlefield is far behind him. In Maggie's darkest hour, God's hand was there, guiding her steps, opening the right doors, and placing the right people in her path. And in the same way, in our everyday lives, we may never know how close we've been to a blessing until it's standing right in front of us. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or your own miracle story. I would love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey of courage, love, and redemption. May God bless and protect you and your loved ones, today and always.